Right, so if we are all able to hear me, if there's any problem with sound, please let me know. But again, in our theme of we're separate, I'm looking at the idea that we as Christians are separate because we understand wilderness experiences. And my motivation for starting this or thinking about this message and studying this was that passage we came across a few weeks ago from 1 Corinthians, where, referencing the Israelites in the wilderness, Paul advised the church there, do not grumble, as some of them did, in which, by the way, he's being incredibly tactful, because I think it was more a case that all of them did. Now, the question is, when we find ourselves in wilderness experiences, perhaps because life is difficult, or perhaps more poignantly, where we feel that God hasn't answered our prayers, or God isn't keeping his promises to us, why might we be there? Why might we find ourselves in that situation? And so we're going to look a little bit more in depth at the case of Israel, because I'm going to take the rather unusual standpoint of saying that I think Israel was somewhat justified in their complaining. And it had to do with the fact that there is nothing more disappointing in life than having high expectations and then encountering a reality that doesn't quite live up to those expectations. Here's what I'm talking about. God said to the Israelites, I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, lots of ites, a land flowing with milk and honey. Okay? Now, if you were a slave in Egypt in misery, and someone came along to you and said, how about we leave? How about we set off on a short journey, and I'm going to take you to this wonderful country flowing with milk and honey, naturally, you'd be fairly well motivated to go along with that. Unfortunately, a little bit later on, we discover that God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, which, by the way, was the shortest route. God led the people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea, and they commenced, on God's command, to wander around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I think they had reasonable justification to be disappointed. They thought they were going somewhere wonderful, instead of which they didn't. They ended up in the middle of the desert. And I want to just emphasize that disappointment by pointing out to you that the journey from Egypt to Canaan was not something with which they were unfamiliar. Go back all the way to the story of Abraham. The minute that things got a little difficult in Canaan, he shot off down to Egypt. And if you add up the dates mentioned in that account, you find that between Abraham leaving Canaan, going down to Egypt, arriving there, getting into a spot of bother with Pharaoh concerning his wife, and traveling back, the entire time elapsed is about 3 months. So it was not a long journey. And then later on, of course, when we get to the story of Joseph, Joseph's brothers who want to kill him decide actually they can make a quick dollar or two out of selling him to some Midianite traders who are traveling through Canaan on their way to Egypt. No suggestion that this is a once-in-a-lifetime journey. And then, of course, later on, when Joseph has risen to be ruler of Egypt, and Father Jacob goes to the cupboard one day and finds it bare, he calls his sons to him, gives them the credit card and the car keys, and says, nip down to Tesco and get some groceries. But of course, it's not the car keys, it's a donkey. And they head off to Egypt, where, of course, they buy grain. And you can read the story if you're unfamiliar with it. What's interesting about this is, as self-sufficient farmers, they would have been able to withstand a year of famine without any difficulty. Because if you think about it, any farmer ever has to cope with a year of not having food coming in every day before the next harvest arrives. So it's only at the end of a year they might begin to suffer difficulty. A few more weeks or maybe months would go by and it would become obvious they were in trouble, and then eventually they would dispatch the sons off to Egypt. They made the journey to Egypt. They returned laden down with grain. They then delayed a return journey for a second time to Egypt as long as they could, because they'd got into a spot of bother with the Egyptian official. And even so, when they finally made their return journey, Joseph said, look, you guys might as well come and live here because we're only in the second year of a 7-year famine. So again, we get this idea that it must have been possible to make that journey back and forth in a relatively short time. And here's the reason why. If you were to set off from Egypt flying a microlight, you would land in Canaan after covering barely 200 miles. If you had to walk by the shortest practicable route, it would be about 250 miles. Now, the route that Israel probably would have ended up taking, if they couldn't go through the land of the Philistines for fear of countering resistance, would be about 400 miles. And so we might be thinking, and particularly if you've read any of the literature on this subject, well, 400 miles is a long way, it would take them a long time. Well, not so much. And I want to address a couple of things I came across in reading what scriptural authors have said about this, by which I mean, scriptural commentators. The first, that Israel would have had to move slowly because, of course, they were carrying all their possessions. And you will sometimes see artwork with people with great bundles and boxes on their backs and on their heads, foot slogging through the desert sand. And after covering about 3 miles, they collapse in a heap and say, oh, we're worn out, we'll have to camp here for the night. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Can I just remind you what it says in Exodus 12, that the Lord caused the Egyptians to look favorably on the Israelites, and they gave the Israelites whatever they asked for. So they stripped the Egyptians of their wealth. Now, just what extent this went to is revealed later on when God instructed Israel to build a pretty impressive tabernacle in the wilderness. And all of a sudden, these people bring gold and silver, bronze, wooden planks even. Well, you don't find many large trees growing in the desert, which they could have cut down. So apparently, they'd even brought high-quality timber with them out of Egypt. Now, what are the chances if you're setting off on a long journey to a new life and you are asset stripping your neighbors and you come out of your neighbor's house weighted down with gold and silver and anything else you can carry, and there's a brand new Mitsubishi pickup on the driveway? What are the chances you're going to turn around and say, oi, I'll have the keys for that as well, please? Now, obviously, 1500 BC, the Mitsubishi pickup was still in development. But there were ox carts and there were donkeys and there were camels. And I can assure you, just because it was a long time ago does not mean that people were so stupid as to set off on a long journey without something to carry their goods for them. And interestingly enough, if you start reading up on this, you discover that an ox cart or a camel train or whatever else can happily cover 20 to 30 miles in a day. Okay, well, here's another myth which sometimes comes up to explain why Israel moved so slowly. Oh, because they had great flocks and herds with them. Well, undoubtedly they did. But here's the interesting thing. I found a source from the UK, one from Australia, and one from the US describing the work of drovers. Back in the day, for example, in this area, before there were refrigerated lorries or trains to carry cattle from Wales across to the Midlands to feed the large cities, all the animals arrived live on the hoof, and they were driven by men called drovers. Interestingly enough, all 3 countries agreed it was possible to move animals 35 miles a day. However, they did point out that drovers would typically not do this because at that mileage, animals would lose condition. In other words, they'd start off from Wales nice and big and fat, and because they were burning more energy than they were able to consume, they would arrive at the meat markets of Birmingham rather thinner. So all sources agreed that you could consistently exceed 20 miles a day without your animals losing condition. And in any case, Israel was not planning to sell their livestock when they arrived in Canaan. They simply wanted to get them there where they could fatten up again on the land flowing with milk and honey. Are you seeing a consistent picture here? There is no reason why Israel could not have covered 20 to 30 miles a day. Which means that, if you do the sums on this, it would have been quite easy for them to make even the 400-mile journey in a month, even if you assume they took a couple of days off every week to rest. And yet, of course, what the scripture tells us is it took them 2 weeks just to get to the Red Sea, 6 weeks to get to Sinai, and then month after month after month, they wandered around in the desert. This is even before they arrived at the borders of Canaan. And God said, well, you're not going in then. You can all, wander around in the desert for 40 years, but that's a different story. So it becomes fairly obvious that God delayed them deliberately. And the question is, why? Well, I'm sure there are many answers, but there's one particular one I'd like to discuss with you this morning. You see, in life, there are fundamentally two groups of people. One group of people are what we call proactive people. The other are reactive people. Any situation you put one of each of these types of people into, they will react to differently. One group of people, the proactive people, will look for a solution to the problem. We can do this. We can find a way through this. We can find a solution to this. The reactive people will simply begin to complain about it. Look at the situation I'm in. Why have you put me in this situation? Why have you brought me here? And I'm sure immediately you can figure out which of these two groups the people of Israel fitted into. Every single time they encountered a problem, why has God brought us here? Why have you led us out here, Moses? Were there no graves in Egypt that we could die there? That kind of thing. Very much reactive people. And that's perfectly understandable given the fact they had been slaves for generations. Slaves are not expected to solve problems for themselves. They're expected to obey and do what they're told. And so they had learned that. Now, this difference is so important because, to quote this gentleman, highly proactive people don't blame circumstances, conditions, or conditioning for their behavior. Their behavior is a product of their own conscious choice. Now, the problem is that if you were, for example, looking for a new manager for your business, which of these two types of people would you want to employ? Well, the answer is obvious. You'd want a proactive person who's going to solve problems and resolve issues. You wouldn't want a reactive person who's going to sit around complaining and being miserable and blaming everyone else for the situation. So what if you were God and you wanted to put a nation in charge of a new country? Well, again, the answer is fairly obvious, isn't it? You would need these people to be proactive. The trouble is they weren't. And so I think one of the reasons God delayed so long was that he needed them to change their attitude before he led them into the land of Canaan. And this presents an interesting sort of paradox for us. This is a little bit off at a tangent, but you see, evolution teaches us that we are no more than the product of circumstances, of external forces acting on a puddle of slime, and out comes a living organism. And then external forces favored one particular organism over another, and so gradually mankind evolved out of the swamp. And of course, if you read Freud, for example, you realize that Freud is basically saying the same thing. We are today, even now, still only the product of our circumstances. You can't behave, you can't help the way you behave because your father didn't do this when you were 3, or your mother did this when you were 2. We can't help feeling that way about certain situations because of certain drives or urges within you. In other words, we are justifying being reactive to every situation. Now, by comparison, the message of the Bible is quite powerful because it says, no, we didn't evolve as a result of external circumstances. We were made by a loving God in the image of God, and we were given the incredibly potent ability to make our own choices. Now, of course, it's a different matter that sadly the first choice, or one of the first choices mankind made, was to rebel against God, but we still have the vestiges of that power within us. We can choose. We are not to be victims of our circumstances. We're not to behave a certain way because of the way we were brought up or whatever else. We are able to make those choices for ourselves. And this is quite a difference between Christianity and what the rest of the world seems to believe. So what lessons can we learn out of the wilderness experience that Israel went through? Well, we have a unique right and a unique responsibility to go with it. The unique responsibility to respond positively to circumstances and situations, even when those circumstances and situations are difficult. And we have to recognize that sometimes God wants to change our character or attitude, and that takes longer than merely addressing behavior. You know, you can change behavior by either offering a sufficient reward for good behavior or offering a sufficiently severe punishment or sanction for bad behavior. But changing the underlying character or attitude takes longer, and that is why sometimes we end up feeling as though God has left us in the wilderness for longer, because he wants us to learn something while we're there. Have a look at this passage from the New Testament, Romans 5 verse 3. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings. What a strange thing to say. We're in a wilderness experience, we're struggling, life is difficult, and Paul says we should glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, which is what we've just spoken about, and character, good character, brings us hope, eternal hope. And suddenly that wilderness experience takes on a different color, a different perspective, as it were, because now we can understand that God is going to bring something good, even out of the dry spells in our lives. But we need to be careful about this. The truth is, those wilderness experiences will not always be about us. And I want to take you to the story of Abraham and illustrate this with the wilderness experience Abraham went through. The story begins in Genesis 12 with God saying, "Leave your country, go to a land which I will show you, and if you do so, I will make you the father of a great nation." Well, Abraham kept his part of the bargain, set off, sold up, packed his tent, and off he went. And then God did not keep his promise for more than 25 years. And I paused there deliberately because I find it useful sometimes to empathize with these Bible characters. And I do wonder sometimes just how long must you wait before you could justifiably conclude the answer was no. 25 years seems more than reasonable to me. But anyway, God did eventually fulfill the promise he'd made. The question is, why wait for that 25 years? Was it about Abraham? Well, if it was, it all went horribly wrong, because it becomes pretty obvious that Abraham lost faith in God's promise. He was very patient for a long time, probably 10 or 12 years, but then things started to come undone. In Genesis 15, God came to Abraham and said, "Don't forget, I promised I'll give you a son." And Abraham more or less shrugged and said, "What are you going to do? I've already written my will. Eliezer of Damascus will inherit all my wealth. He's a good friend. I trust him. Don't bother. Don't worry." Abraham's already starting to lose faith in God's promise. And then, of course, a little bit later on, Abraham took a second wife. Maybe he could solve the problem that way. Well, ironically, he kind of did solve the problem that way, but it wasn't what God's plan was. But again, we see Abraham's lack of faith in God's promise. And then here's one we often skip over in the children's Bible stories. In the next chapter, God again came to Abraham and said, "Look, I haven't forgotten. I'm going to bless you with a son." And Abraham makes a big show of falling down on his face in submission and worship. But it was really just to hide his face as he laughed to himself in disbelief. And then, of course, the passage we all know, where God called on Abraham yet again and said, "Oh, I'm going to make you a father." And this time Sarah laughed. And as anyone who's been married for 50 or 60 years would know, you've gone long past the stage of finishing each other's sentences. By that point, you finish each other's thoughts. And so if Sarah laughed, I'm sure Abraham could barely contain his own laughter. Did Abraham change? Did his faith develop? No, quite the opposite. However, there is something very interesting, because although the story clearly illustrates how Abraham's faith in God's promise diminished, the story also absolutely emphasizes how Abraham's friendship with God grew stronger. So strong, in fact, that God felt comfortable popping into Abraham's house for dinner. And there aren't many situations in the Bible where that happens. That's how good a friendship they had. And even more so, after dinner, God sort of takes Abraham aside and says, "There's something I'd like to talk over with you." Because it turns out from the story that God didn't feel comfortable exacting judgment upon Sodom without first talking it over with his friend Abraham. And you've got to think, well, hang on, the God of all the universe is dropping by Abraham's house to chat things over with his friend before he acts. That's how good their friendship had become. And that stands in contrast to what most people do. Because most people, if they feel disappointed in God, if they feel God hasn't answered their prayer, if they feel that God isn't keeping his promises, they break off the friendship with God. But Abraham did the opposite. Although his faith in God's promise had clearly diminished or even expired entirely, he still pursued a friendship with God. And that's a lesson that we should do well to learn. Pursue a friendship with God even when we feel that God maybe isn't doing what we thought he should do, even when we're going through a wilderness experience. So why did God make Abraham wait? Well, I think the answer is to be found in this verse. By the time God did keep his promise, Abraham and Sarah were both very old, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. You see, there comes a point in a lady's life where she knows that the cupboard is bare. There is no more prospect of children. I'm sure, there's months or a year or two in between when it might or it might not, 1 month, then another month not, and it's still possible. But when it says that Sarah was long past the age of having children, we can be pretty sure that she knew what she was talking about, and Abraham would have known as well. And I think that's the key to unlocking this story. Imagine this. Imagine a man who, middle-aged, has achieved a fair amount of material wealth. He's comfortably off, he has a nice house, the mortgage is paid off, there's no debt, he can afford to go on holiday, he can afford a nice suit and a nice car. Now imagine this man's a Christian. He might feel that his prosperity is the result of God's blessing on his life. But a non-Christian might look at his life and say, no, it's nothing to do with it. It's just because you worked hard and studied in the evenings and took a second job and lived frugally and invested wisely, and that's why you've achieved financial success. And the simple truth of the matter is, it would be impossible to prove the case one way or the other. Because one thing's certain, this man would not have been successful, even with God's blessing, if he hadn't worked hard, lived frugally, and invested wisely. And it's equally true that other people who have no faith in God and therefore no claim on God's blessings, people who work hard and live frugally and invest wisely, also achieve prosperity. So you couldn't prove the thing one way or another. Now imagine also that 6 months after God came to Abraham and said, I'm going to make you a father of a very special child who will be the father of a great nation, Sarah fell pregnant. How would you know whether that child was really the child of promise or simply the consequence of a time of intimacy between a husband and a wife? And the answer is you couldn't possibly know. And yet it was very, very important for the lineage of Israel, and for another reason which I'll explain in a moment, that it become very, very clear that this child was indeed a miraculous child of promise. It's important for the lineage of Israel because, of course, their whole claim to being God's special people is driven by the fact that they are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, that son of promise. But there's another reason, and it has to do with this thing called types. Before Christ was revealed in the New Testament, Christ was very much revealed in the Old Testament through 2 means. One of those means we're familiar with, and it's prophecy. The other means is through the stories of people whose lives in some way exemplify Jesus or what Jesus would do. Now, to understand types, I think it's important not to get too bogged down in any one type, because what you have to do to really see a full picture of Christ is take one type and superimpose another type on top of it, and then another one on top, and so on. And eventually, as you weave these stories together, you will get a fairly comprehensive picture of the life of Christ. Take, for example, the story of Joseph. Now, I'm not going to read through every single one of these points for you. If you want to come back to this video later and look at it, you can. But there are certain key similarities between the life of Joseph and the life of Christ. For example, both were betrayed by people who should have been closest to them. Jesus by his disciples, Joseph by his brothers. Both were sold for a price in silver. Both were falsely accused of wrongdoing. And eventually, as a result of their suffering, both of them brought, in Christ's sake, salvation to millions of people, and in Joseph's case, life and food to possibly millions of people. So you can see the similarities there. But let's look at the life of Isaac, this miraculous son of promise who was born through the will of God, not as a result of human passion. And we find that the comparisons are even more powerful. Both Jesus and Isaac were promised sons who were miraculously conceived. Then, later on in the story of Abraham, we have this utterly bizarre case where God asks Abraham to go and turn that son into a human sacrifice. And what's interesting about that story is the story makes no sense if you read it as a standalone story. Only when you understand it as a type of Christ does that story begin to make any sense, because there's no way you can make sense out of a story in which God asks a father to make a human sacrifice of his son when it was known that God found human sacrifices abominable. As a type of Christ, it makes sense. It makes sense also that the son, Isaac, who was old enough to have fought off his father and run for his life, voluntarily went through with the process, except of course he didn't quite, because God called a stop to it just in time. But that made him very much like Christ, who gave up his own life on the cross. And you can see other similarities there between the two. None of which, by the way, would make any sense if Isaac was simply a son born of human passion. It only works if Isaac is a miraculously conceived child. And so we come to draw certain conclusions out of this part of the story as well. When we find ourselves in wilderness experiences, we do need to consider ourselves, our behavior, our choices, even our character, our attitudes. Is there something God is trying to change or teach us in this? Do we need to change our behavior? Do we need to change our attitude? Or are we looking for a longer term change of character? But it's not always about us. Sometimes God has a complex plan which might affect us, but which we might never understand during our life. Because I'm sure that even as Abraham waited and waited in the wilderness experience for God to finally keep his promise, even as Abraham went through that strange role play of taking his son up a mountain to make a sacrifice out of him, I don't know that Abraham fully understood that. It was only when we look back on it that we start to understand that all of this was a type of Christ. And so as we learn these lessons, we realize that we need to trust God, have faith in God, even when in the wilderness of difficulty in our lives. And to take to heart that warning that Paul gave the church in Corinth: do not grumble, as some of them did. My prayer is that we take this to heart, that we live lives of faith and trust in God, no matter what life brings to us, or no matter where God leads us. Amen.